Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. My name is David.
My name is Matt.
And we are the Taylor Bros.
Every week.
So we talked a little bit about being a non-anxious presence, and some of that is understanding our world or having a view of the world, and maybe even there are competing stories within that world.
Yes.
What did you want to talk about today? Because I think it's related, right?
Yeah, we've had in our list of episode ideas for a long time this kind of statement of what you believe matters. And then there's another question that I found quite helpful, just generally in either conflict resolution or trying to understand why maybe I'm feeling a big emotion is, what's the story you're telling yourself? I thought let's mash those together and talk about the stories we believe, or the story I believe about the world is really important, especially when we talk about something like anxiety, being a non-anxious presence. And because if I believe that there is a meta-narrative of the world is going somewhere, this is, ultimately, this is the problem, these are the potential solutions, and this is what salvation looks like, which I think everybody, regardless of what your actual religious beliefs are, we all hold to some form of that. We just put different things in those blocks. Depending on what I believe it is, that arc, is that story, that will change how I show up in the world. It will change actually my response to certain things. And can I really can I become non-anxious? Or because if I believe in scientific naturalism and atheism, ultimately the best I can do is distract myself from the truth that I believe, that ultimately is all meaningless and that we're all ending up in just atoms, and there's nothing more to it than that.
Yeah, it's a purely physical or observable thing.
And all I can do ultimately in my life is do what feels good, avoid as much pain as possible, and perhaps because we've decided as a species that generally it's good to treat other people well, then maybe try to minimize pain for other people. But ultimately all I can do is avoid the cold hard truth of we're just going to end up towards nihilism.
So I think this is interesting because there are competing stories in the world. So
yes.
Many liberal democracies believe some version of progress is the driver of history.
Yes.
Right. Which competes with a Christian worldview, which would be that God is the driver of history.
Yes.
Right. And so they're competing. And we have stories in the countries and the cultures we grow up in, which we don't even, and this is the challenge, know are the stories. Yes. We just assume these are true about the world, which is why traveling to a different country and living there for some amount of time, or traveling through history and living there for some amount of time can be really valuable, because you realize that these have not always been assumptions. And so maybe these assumptions are assumptions and not necessarily true.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do you travel through time? Well, you can't go forward other than at a normal pace, but you can go backwards through things that you read.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was particularly piqued, my interest was piqued on this topic as well this week, having listened to a couple of interviews from a somewhat well-known lady called Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who she sort of shot to fame in the sort of maybe noughties, sort of the early 2000s, with appearing alongside people like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, who were part of that new atheist crowd who were pressing, look, this is the way forward, and we can ditch with religion. She was I think born, I don't know exactly how long, raised in Somalia, and then effectively fled from there, I think, as a refugee to Europe. And as part of her journey, I think sometime after 9/11, she moved from being a Muslim to being an atheist. And she was in that land for quite a long time. She was in that space for probably the best part of 20 years.
And she, like you said, she shot to fame because these new atheists saw, and this is the progress. This is the story of progress. Scientific rationalism has won out.
Yep.
She's left that, superstitious belief behind.
Yep.
And now she's believing this.
Yeah, she was the poster child of someone shedding their religious, effectively the constraints of the old narratives and the old stories. But remarkably, in the last year, she has come out and said, actually, I've after having effectively some pretty significant pain and some crisis moments in the last year or two, she has now become a Christian. And a lot of people were going, well, maybe it's just a cultural thing. And I think this will tie back into, and this may be where we'll go with our conversation, but because some of her early interviews were very much, she believed that the story of the Judeo-Christian worldview was necessary to combat some of the other stories that are pressing in on, effectively, the Western world. And if we cut off from that story, there is nothing to hold against it. So she specifically mentioned radical Islam and effectively radical, I think, wokeism, the word she used quite a lot, like that left-leaning liberal, let's tear everything up and redefine everything. And so she was going, I realised that there needed to be something, a stronger narrative, and the Judeo-Christian worldview is what that was. And so I was fascinated by this. And lots of people thought, oh, maybe it's just purely a cultural thing. Turns out that if you listen more, it's definitely a personal thing for her. But from our conversation for the rest of what we're going to talk about, I thought, let's talk about what the story you believe matters and what that actually influences in terms of your life and non-anxious presence and things
because
like that.
These are really big things, right? Our society, our culture are telling messages, they're telling stories about what is true about life and what is true about us as individuals. And one of the stories that's really pervasive, we alluded to, is this idea that we are individuals, that actually we can have this freedom and autonomy, and it's the right thing to discover who you are and go on that self-discovery journey. And I think that takes an ounce of truth and blows it up into become a huge truth, which maybe actually has some question marks around. Because if you believe that story, that it's about my freedom, it's about my self-discovery, if something goes wrong, it's all your fault. And you have to take responsibility for that. And that can be a heavy burden for people. That's why probably there's such a big fear of failure, because fear of failure is not just I failed, it's I am a failure. And so everything, because it's all about you, it's all about your individual, and it takes away the community. Whereas if you have come from other places and maybe you believe, hey, the community is really important, and it's not just about me, who I am is reflective of my family and my village and the things I've grown up with, they are important, then you are in some way shielded, because they're still your family, you're still part of your community, even if something goes wrong, and even that community can support you. Absolutely. So for me, where does this come to? Because you said earlier about the unspoken assumptions, you know, the water we swim in, the air we breathe. The story I'm telling myself is not isolated from the story that is being told to me by the advertisers, is not isolated from the story you're telling yourself, the life we believe. We were at a wedding recently. In fact, we took part in helping that happen as the best men. And I remember chatting with some friends and going, well, I was speaking to the parents of the groom and asking how was their wedding. And they were like, oh yeah, we had this small thing in the village hall and there was just like 20 or 30 people. It wasn't anything big. One generation later, what does a wedding look like? Well, a wedding looks a certain way because we've all been told this is what the perfect wedding must look like. And iteration after iteration, that vision grows and grows and grows and grows. And so the story we believe about a wedding is got to look like this. The white, the flowers, the three-course meal. Even pre-wedding, right? That whole thing with the diamond ring, that's only a relatively recent thing in human history, which basically the people who mined diamonds had a lot of diamonds. They could control the supply, but they wanted to increase the demand. So the idea of a diamond ring, that has been pushed, not by accident, by somebody.
For sure.
And so if you don't realise that, you think, well, it's what we all do. It's what we've always done.
Yeah.
No, it's not. And like you said, now it's a 3-course meal and you pay for entertainment and you're entertaining people for a whole day. And, you should be spending 20 or 30 grand, on this. And,
And so, in a sense, some of the episodes we've done this year have been touching on some of these topics. We've talked about storytelling and the power there. we just both finished reading another book called Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer, an author we both appreciate and have come to learn a lot from. One of the things that he talked about in one aspect of the book was the idea of the importance of preaching. And he goes, we do not like that in our society, especially when it comes from Christianity. People don't like to be preached at. We literally say, don't preach at me. But one of the things he said was, everybody's preaching, or everybody's proselytizing, or everybody's evangelizing for their thing. We do it all the time. We can't not do it. I suppose the point of this episode that I'm landing on is, it's not necessarily, oh, am I doing this or am I not? Am I believing a story? Am I not? It's, let's get to the root. Let's underlie or get to that awareness. Mm-hmm. What is the story I'm believing? What is salvation? What is the good? What is the bad? What's that arc? Because otherwise, I'm being led by other people's stories and I'm not even aware of it.
Mm-hmm. And most of us are not, right? Like, I think you understand it. It's like we have a street level understanding of the world.
Yeah.
And so you have to think about it. And we're so busy not thinking about it and not realizing that these things are influencing us, even if they influence us in how we react against them.
For sure. And going back to that quote from last week, like the network was responding to those high emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't actually come to the table when it comes to these big narratives with this calm, cool rationality. We are being driven by our emotions. And once you've got someone emotional, it's very easy to manipulate us, isn't it?
So anyway, that's a rambly conversation about the stories.
A less scripted one
that we float in and are around us, and how they might influence us or not. And I think that is interesting, because the reason we've used the word story is because some of them are just stories, and actually with a bit of examining, we might find them to not be true. Anyway, let us know what you're thinking, what you enjoy, and we'll speak to you next week.
We'll speak to you.
Bye.
You'll listen to us. Ciao, guys.